Welcome back to Medieval Times Archive, where medieval history isn't a tale of honor, but a battlefield of blood, steel, and survival. You've seen knights in shining armor clash, swords under banners of nobility, their duels choreographed like elegant dances. But real medieval sword fighting? It was anything but graceful. Imagine a world where armor grinds against armor, where every blow aims not to impress, but to kill, where a knight doesn't swing his sword like a dancer, but grips it by the blade and smashes your skull with the hilt like a hammer. This isn't the fantasy Hollywood sold you. This is brutal, raw, close-quarters combat, the kind that decides life or death in seconds. So ask yourself, if you were thrown into a real medieval duel, would you survive? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking truth behind medieval sword fighting, its weapons, its techniques, and its killers. And if you're fascinated by the darkest corners of history, from knights and crusaders to torture and forgotten battles, the sword, a symbol of honor, power, and death, from the compact and practical arming sword to the versatile long sword wielded with both hands, from the fearsome falchion, shaped like a butcher's blade, to the towering greatsword, longer than a man's arm span. Each blade was born with purpose and forged with identity. These weren't just tools of war. They were extensions of the warrior's soul. To wear a sword was to carry authority. To draw one meant you were ready to spill blood. In the noble courts of Europe, swords were status symbols. Lavishly decorated hilts, personalized pommels, blades inscribed with names or blessings. Each told a story about its owner. Owning a sword meant you were someone. Training with it, that meant you were dangerous. On the battlefield, the sword was both savior and executioner. A knight's blade might have been his last line of defense in the chaos of combat. When lances shattered, shields broke, and blood blinded the eyes. But swords weren't limited to war. They held weight in the court of law. In some medieval legal systems, disputes, especially among nobles, could be settled by trial by combat. The sword became the judge, jury, and executioner. Victory meant righteousness. Defeat was guilt sealed in blood. Even in death, the sword had meaning. Many warriors were buried with their blades, believing they'd need them in the next life. Some swords were passed down across generations, gaining legends of their own. Others were lost in battlefields, only to be unearthed centuries later, silent witnesses to forgotten carnage. Whether in ceremony or slaughter, in peace or war, the sword shaped medieval society. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a declaration, a threat, a legacy, and for many, it was the last thing they ever saw. In reality, medieval sword fighting was a brutal, calculated science, far from the romantic duels you see on screen. It was an art form, yes, but one of survival, not showmanship. The techniques weren't invented randomly. They were recorded in detailed manuals called Fechtbücher, fight books, compiled by masters at arms across medieval Europe. Among the most famous, Johannes Lichtenauer and Hans Talhoffer. Their illustrations show knights grappling, locking, and striking in ways that seem almost modern in their pragmatism. Take half-swording, for example. Instead of always swinging from a distance, a fighter would grip the middle of their own blade, yes, even the sharp part, using a gloved hand for control and precision. This allowed them to thrust accurately into weak spots in an opponent's armor: the throat, armpits, groin, or mordhaw, literally murder stroke. Here, the swordsman flips the weapon and strikes with the pommel or cross guard like a war hammer, crushing helmets and cracking skulls. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Then there was ringen, grappling. Fechtbuches taught how to throw, disarm, or pin your opponent using joint locks and leverage. A duel could end not with a cut, but with a violent slam to the ground and a dagger to the neck. Combat wasn't clean. It wasn't choreographed. It was chaotic. But behind the chaos was years of disciplined training. Just like modern martial arts, fighters didn't just memorize moves. They practiced timing, distance, and intent, because a mistake in sparring might get you bruised. But a mistake in real combat meant death. These ancient manuals weren't written for sport. They were written to prepare you for war, for duels, for ambushes, anything where steel met flesh. Modern practitioners of historical European martial arts, or HEMA, have revived these techniques. They've proven, time and again, that medieval combat was far more technical and deadly than fiction would have us believe. Sword fighting wasn't just about strength. It was about control, strategy, and the cold, precise execution of a fatal plan. When a knight drew his sword, he wasn't performing. He was calculating his next kill. Think a sword slash could cut through a steel breastplate. Think again. When both fighters were clad in full plate armor, slashing became almost useless. The blade would glance off. Sparks might fly, but no damage was done. That's why real armored combat was something else entirely. It was not about cutting, it was about finding the cracks. Knights were trained to strike not at the armor, but around it. They aimed for the weak points, the small gaps the armor couldn't cover. The throat, where the helmet meets the chest. The armpits, exposed when raising a weapon. The groin, often protected only by chain mail or cloth padding. Each attack had to be surgical. A thrust wasn't just thrown wildly. It was measured, timed, and placed with deadly accuracy. Because when your opponent is fully armored, there is no second chance. One wrong move, one misstab, and you're the one bleeding out in the mud. This is where techniques like half-swording truly mattered. By gripping the blade in the middle, a knight could guide it like a spear, targeting the tiny spaces between plates. Speed was no longer about swinging fast. It was about precision under pressure. And when things got close, grappling and wrestling weren't optional. They were necessary. A knight might drive his opponent to the ground just to expose a weak spot and finish the fight with a dagger thrust to the eye slit. This wasn't theatrical. It wasn't elegant. It was brutal, exhausting, and terrifying. Armored combat wasn't a game of strength. It was a test of control, strategy, and nerves of steel. Every motion counted. Every mistake could be fatal. Because in a real sword fight, you didn't win by looking good. You survived by being deadly. On the battlefield, sword fighting was chaos. You weren't facing just one enemy. You were surrounded by screaming men, flying arrows, mud, and blood. There were no rules, no honor, just raw instinct and the will to survive. In the heat of battle, formations broke, comrades fell, and you fought whoever came at you next. A sword wasn't always your first choice. It was your last resort. Once spears shattered and shields were lost, the sword became the tool of desperation. Fast strikes, dirty moves, kill or be killed. In that storm of violence, there was no room for style, only brutal efficiency. But in a duel, a one-on-one fight, the chaos narrowed and the pressure sharpened. These were often ritualized, bound by custom, sometimes even watched by nobility. But don't be fooled, duels were no less deadly. They were slower, more calculated, but still unforgiving. In the Holy Roman Empire and other parts of medieval Europe, trial by combat was a legitimate legal process. If words failed, swords would decide. Two men would enter the arena, each believing in their right, each prepared to die for it. And the outcome wasn't just personal. It could determine property, titles, even the fate of entire families. There were no appeals. The blade was final. Some duels were fought in armor, with long swords. Others were raw and primal, fought shirtless, barefoot, with nothing but a dagger and desperation. One wrong move didn't mean points lost. It meant life lost. Whether on the battlefield or in the dueling pit, medieval sword fighting was never a dance. It was a blood-soaked negotiation, with death as the closing argument. So the next time you see a knight bowing politely before a fight, remember, behind that gesture might be a promise that only one of them would walk away. Movies have taught us to see sword fights as elegant dances, flowing spins, dramatic clashes, and perfectly timed leaps. But real knights didn't dance. They struck like lightning. In real combat, there were no flashy pirouettes or choreographed flourishes. There was no time, because the first clean hit could end the fight. Let's talk about the sword itself. No, it wasn't as heavy as a car. A typical long sword weighed around 1.2 to 1.6 kilograms, light enough to swing repeatedly, fast enough to kill. It was a finely tuned killing machine, not a theatrical prop. But even with that speed, fights didn't last long. They weren't designed to. A duel between trained fighters could be over in seconds, not minutes of dramatic back and forth. And forget about trading hits like in a movie. In real life, One hit could mean a shattered rib, a pierced artery, or a crushed skull. Victory didn't go to the most stylish fighter. It went to the one who was cold, cunning, and willing to do whatever it took to survive. There were no dramatic speeches mid-fight, no slow-motion moments of reflection, only sweat, steel, and split-second decisions. Real knights used every trick they knew. Feints, sudden thrusts, grappling, and even throwing dirt in your face if it gave them an edge. Because in the real world, honor didn't always matter. Survival did. Hollywood has made sword fighting look clean, even romantic. But the truth is far bloodier. Blades bent, bones broke, men screamed, and when the fight was over, there was no applause, only silence, and maybe the sound of armor hitting the ground. So the next time you see a knight spinning his sword like a bat, ask yourself, is he trying to win, or just putting on a show? Throughout the Middle Ages, a sword was never just a weapon. It was a reflection of the soul, a personal extension of the warrior who carried it. For knights, the sword was forged not only in fire and steel, but in blood, duty, and memory. It was earned through trials, consecrated in battle, and often buried with its master. Some old knights, long past their days of war, still kept their blades close, hands trembling with age. They would trace the worn edge of their sword, not out of longing for violence, but for the weight of what it meant. A lifetime carved into steel. That sword had protected them. It had seen comrades fall, enemies flee, oaths sworn and broken. It had tasted rain, sweat, and sometimes tears. And in some cases, it had taken lives in the name of a cause the world had long forgotten. These swords, if they survived, became relics. Not just museum pieces, but silent witnesses to centuries of conflict and courage. Each nick on the blade, a frozen scream. Each rusted patch, a dry drop of history. A sword could be your salvation, or your executioner. It could lift you to glory, or cut you down without warning. In battle, there were no second chances. The difference between life and death could be just a few centimeters of sharp steel. That's why the sword became more than just a tool. It became a symbol of loyalty, of power, of mortality. And in a time when a man's worth was often measured by how he fought, a sword was his legacy. Even today, these ancient weapons speak in silence. They whisper stories of valor, betrayal, desperation, and unbreakable resolve. They remind us that behind every blade was a beating heart, and behind every duel, a decision that could never be undone. Fade to black. Quiet. Then, music swells slightly. Tone shifts with curiosity. But now a question. What happens when two warrior cultures collide? A knight of medieval Europe, steel-clad, trained in brutal precision, versus a samurai of feudal Japan, fast, disciplined, and deadly with his katana. Both sworn to codes of honor, both born into war. If they met, one-on-one, sword against sword, who would survive? Steel from the west, or steel from the east? Final line, delivered slowly, with suspense. That's the story we'll explore in our next episode.